So I started off this vignette with the case of abortion. But the question, or the puzzle that I'm trying to answer today, is a little bit broader, which is why did the national parties, which once held overlapping and diverse views, or really no views, on non-prominent culture war issues like abortion, guns, gay rights, or immigration, why did they go from overlapping to dividing on each of those issues, such that Democrats today hold what we would call consistently liberal positions across each of those issues, and why would Republicans hold consistently conservative positions across each of these issues? And sort of thinking about a way of how to frame this up for this audience, one of the central questions that really motivates this book, and I'm trying to get at and trying to think about, is before the parties polarized, when they still had overlapping views, could elites have aligned, for example, the pro-life movement with liberal causes inside the Democratic Party? What was the possibility for some different alignment of issues in our party system? And we'll get back to this in a little bit, but what's really interesting is that there were very, very prominent forces trying to do just that. So this picture here, this woman on the left, is Nellie Gray. She would go on to found the March for Life, a now very prominent anti-abortion rally. And she was a liberal Democrat that tried to ally her cause in the Democratic Party, and she really failed to do so. Now, at the heart of this argument, it's really a sequential argument. And so I want to pause and go over some contours of political history for folks that aren't political science majors. So a few points here. First is between the 1930s and the 1960s, the stylized view is that the national parties, party conflict was defined by economic issues. And civil rights was purposefully suppressed. And the parties actually held similar positions on civil rights in this mid-century era. That changes in 1964, when the national parties divide on civil rights. Democrats move to the left, and Republicans move to the right. Then, shortly after this happens, what we might call today these, quote, culture war issues, like abortion, guns, a little bit later, gay rights and immigration, become salient to national political conflict. So if you pick up a newspaper in the 1960s, you wouldn't see fights between Democrats and Republicans over abortion and guns. That starts to happen in the 70s and 80s. And then in the 1980s and 1990s, the national parties divide on each one of these cultural issues. And the point that I argue in the book is that the parties dividing on issues like abortion and gun control is fundamentally tied to the fact that the parties divided on civil rights in the 1960s. And the stylized fact that I rely on for this book is that if you look at public opinion, going all the way back to the 1930s, to the first public opinion polls, you see these issue bundles among the mass public. Folks who are more conservative on race express more conservative views on issues of women's rights, or gun control, or immigration. And these bundles predate the national party splitting on these issues and existed much earlier than an existing scholarship recognizes. Now, I don't want to get too academic, but it is an academic book, so I want to briefly kind of frame this argument in context of an existing literature, which I'm pushing back against, or I'm adding to. So an existing literature on political parties argues that when polarization was at its low point, there were many different ways that the parties could go. And party change was primarily driven by politicians, activists, and media figures. And voters really follow along and play a passive role. And there's a whole bunch of different shapes this argument takes. But I want to read a quote from a prominent theory of issue evolutions by two political scientists, Carmines and Stimson. And they're making this argument in context of civil rights. And they argue that visible changes in elite behavior realign the constitution, realign the constellation of voter issue attitudes and party identifications to reflect earlier changes among the elite. And they're talking about this in context of civil rights. And a really crucial linchpin of their argument is that Lyndon Johnson in 1964 took the Democrats to the left on civil rights, but he could have just as easily moved the Democrats to the right on civil rights. And this theory of issue evolutions has been applied across a whole bunch of different issues: civil rights, abortion, the environment, defense spending, and gay rights. And so you might imagine, had elites acted in a different way, a whole bunch of different constellation of issues could have aligned themselves in the party system. Now, this theory that really emerges in the parties literature is also echoed in a lot of the literature on public opinion. So there's a very prominent book called Democracy for Realists by two political scientists, Chris Aiken and Larry Bartels, and they call this traditional sense of democracy, where parties or government, as being responsive to voters, is, quote, the folk theory of democracy. It doesn't quite work like that. And a central part of their argument that simmers out in a lot of the literature on public opinion is that voters are not very ideological. And when scholars of public opinion say ideological, what they mean is someone is ideological if they're liberal on issue X, issue Y, and issue Z. And to the extent that voters are ideological, according to Aiken and Bartels, is that it often turns out to be just a rather mechanical reflection of what their favorite group and party leaders have instructed them to think. So if a Democrat is pro-choice and favors gun control, according to this view, it's because they've learned those positions from elites and they reflect that in survey attitudes. So how does my argument differ? Here's a blank graph, and we're going to fill it in with some things. On the x-axis is year, and on the y-axis is I'm going to plot some correlation coefficients. And we'll explain that in just a second. And then I've made a red line here in 1980, which reflects the point when the national parties divide on abortion and when they divide on the Equal Rights Amendment. And if you look at public opinion after 1980, what each one of these correlation coefficients is what they're called. A positive correlation coefficient in this case means that voters who are more conservative on race also express more conservative views on issues of women's rights. Now, these top-down theories of public opinion would argue that the reason we see this in the mass public is because, well, the national parties have divided on civil rights, they've divided on issues of women's rights, and voters are following along. And they would expect, if you look at public opinion before that point, this correlation would fall to zero or would fluctuate. And my point, and one of my contributions, is that if you look at public opinion, going back to the very first public opinion data, you see a remarkably consistent cluster of views. And so I argue that voters, in a very, very important way, are ideological, that they've clustered these issue attitudes together on the racial axis. And this happened before the national parties divided. And this is consequential because when the white South, which is solidly Democratic, enters into the GOP or becomes up for grabs after the racial realignment, they're quietly bringing these other issue attitudes with them. And you can think about it from the right, which is that Republican politicians who are already pursuing racial conservatism, unmoored from the Democratic Party on account of civil rights, realized that these voters also held very conservative views across these other cultural issues, and pursued these positions to win these voters over. And crucial for the argument is that the Republican Party viewed winning the South and racial conservatives as really essential for the party to succeed. So let's rewind a second and go over this a little bit more slowly. So this section I call the plight of the mid-century GOP. And this is really important for what comes next. The Republican Party, in the wake of the Great Depression, is decimated. So Franklin Roosevelt, a Democrat, institutes his New Deal. It's incredibly popular. And Republicans really suffer at the polls. They did so bad that Gallup, a then newly formed polling organization, is asking people whether they think the Republican Party is dead. And the Republicans are in such bad shape that only in 2 elections between 1930 and 1994 do Republicans control a majority in the House of Representatives. And the stylized view in this mid-century era, between 1930 and let's say 1960, is that party conflict really centers on economic issues. And civil rights is suppressed. It's purposely tried to be kept off the agenda. Why? Because the Democratic coalition includes both the white South and African Americans who are united together by the crisis, the economic crisis of the Depression, but hold very divergent views on civil rights. Now, this idea that the Republican Party isn't doing well is at the front of at least some Republican minds, and especially conservative Republicans. So one Nixon aide writes to Richard Nixon, prior to the 1972 elections. It says the Republican Party is a last place ball club. Republicans are only 22% of the vote, meaning people who call themselves Republican are only 22% of the vote. Bob Dole, who will be a vice presidential candidate later this year, says the GOP is in worse shape than it has ever been. And a syndicated columnist is writing, it is hard for me to see how the Republican Party can survive beyond 1976. It's a grim landscape. Why is this? Especially among conservative politicians, they viewed, and probably were correct to some degree, that the Democrats' economic policies were very popular, and the New Deal loomed large. And there was this, what's called the New Deal consensus. And conservatives complained about this and said, look, Republicans today are effectively watered down Democrats. We're not different enough. And the economic policies are very popular. And on economic issues alone, there cannot be elected a Republican congressional majority. We cannot outbid the liberal Democrats on economic issues. This is a Reagan campaign aide that would later go on to serve in Reagan's White House. So they view this, we're going to continue fighting on this economic plane. We're going to continue to lose. However, something offers an inroads into Democrats' dominant coalition. And that's civil rights. So the civil rights movement pushes the issue to the top of the agenda. And in 1964, Lyndon Johnson, the Democratic nominee, a senator from Texas, from the South, embraces the civil rights movement. And Barry Goldwater, who was a Republican nominee in 1964, pursues the GOP nomination and then the presidency through embracing a backlash to civil rights. And it's hard to convey, but what I want to convey is just what a remarkable juncture in political history. The Democratic Party had for a long time been the party of the South and the Confederacy, and the Republican Party had been the party of Lincoln and civil rights. And in '64, that seems to completely flip. And Goldwater wins 5 states in the South, one of which, Georgia, a Republican had never won, and the other 3 hadn't won it since 1870. So this is an absolutely remarkable shift. This region had been really solidly Democratic, and Goldwater, who doesn't do terribly well, makes huge inroads into this part of the coalition. So the parties at this point are realigning in context of civil rights. But underneath the surface, they're also realigning on other issues as well. And they're realigning quietly. Why? Because civil rights is clustered with a range of opinions on all these other different cultural war attitudes. And I say quietly because, again, gay rights or abortion or gun control aren't being fought at the national political level. And so I showed this graph a little bit earlier with respect to race and issues of women's equality, but let's take a look with gun control and racial attitudes. So years on the x-axis, we're going to plot some correlation coefficients on the y-axis, and in 1980 I put a red line marking the point where the National Party platform divide on issues of gun control. And if you look at public opinion data after 1980, we see that those attitudes are clustered together as you might expect. And maybe the explanation is, well, the parties have divided, it's part of conflict, people are following along, good, great. But if you look at public opinion before, it looks remarkably similar, going all the way back to 1940. This is an enduring feature of public opinion that is working its way upwards into the party system. So I do this with guns, I do it with the environment, an issue of gay rights, abortion, and then broader issues of women's equality, and then I also have a chapter on immigration. So why am I calling this Racial Realignment's Cascading Effect? It's the title of this section. It's because the racial realignment changed the underlying electoral coalitions, some of it immediately, but it also changed who was up for grabs. And this has tremendous consequences for what comes next. So I want to think about this in the context of just one issue, abortion politics. So in 1972, Nixon really is the first national candidate to, in the general election, use abortion as an issue to win over voters. And Nixon in 1972 is worried about the Republicans are in tough shape. If we rely just on Republican voters, it's going to be hard to win. And in the back of his mind, what he's thinking about is the 68 election, where he barely wins over Hubert Humphrey. And there's this guy, George Wallace, who has a third-party candidacy, which is effectively a one-issue candidacy opposed to segregation. And Wallace wins some votes in electoral college in the South, the last third-party candidate to do so. So this is in the back of Nixon's mind. And so think, Nixon could move either to the left to expand the Republican coalition or move to the right. The racial realignment fundamentally shapes his choice by shaping who is up for grabs. And what is particularly interesting about Nixon is that he runs in 1960 and is the Republican nominee in 1960. And at that point, he saw moving to the left as a strategy. He actually taxed to the left on civil rights in 1960 because he's fearing that he's going to get primaried from the left, from Nelson Rockefeller and what was called the Northeastern establishment, which was more liberal on civil rights and also on economic issues. So he sees moving to the left in 1960s, as did other Republican politicians, as a means to expand the coalition. Remember, the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. African Americans were viewed as a traditional Republican constituency. However, the racial realignment took these voters out of play. And Nixon and his team are explicitly talking about this. White racial liberals and African Americans, who perhaps maybe were up for grabs, or maybe even a little more Republican in the 50s or early 60s, are now locked into the Democratic Party. But it unmoors another constituency. It unmoors conservative Democrats in the white South. We'll talk about conservative Catholics in the Northeast and the Midwest that are alienated from the Democratic Party's newly adopted position on civil rights. And Nixon and other Republican figures at this time become very focused on how do we win over Goldwater Democrats or Wallace Democrats, people who called themselves Democrats, who voted for Democrats in this New Deal party system, but had become unmoored from the coalition. And Nixon views abortion as a currency to appeal to these voters. So I sort of just said this, but I'm putting a quote up here to make a point, which is Nixon and operatives, and this is mostly true, which is that Democrats, Catholic Democrats, are more numerous and easier to win over than Black Democrats and Jewish Democrats. So they're viewing as the African Americans or liberal Democrats as out of play, but Catholic Democrats are up for grabs. Why is that? Catholics, although they were Democratic for a long time, have become unmoored from the party, first on the issue of civil rights, and then on the So conservative Catholics have become alienated from the Democratic Party. But they also, the Nixon campaign also faced a conundrum, which is that these ideologically alienated Democrats are pulled towards the Nixon campaign on law and order and race, but away from us on the economic issue. They're saying, look, we can't win these voters on economic issues, but they might like our racial issues, but they're also been Democratic forever. So how can we finish off the realignment? How can we continue and to lock these voters into the GOP? And they say outreach should be multifaceted. It has to be. And they developed a strategy and this calculation. And in the book, I lay out public opinion data showing that these Wallace Democrats, or these Goldwater Democrats, are incredibly conservative on abortion, guns, and gay rights already in 1964 and in 1968. And so when these Republican campaigns in the 70s and 80s use these issues, they're speaking to this pre-existing sentiment. And so here's a Nixon aide saying, when Nixon comes out for aid to parochial schools, this will drive a wedge right down the middle of the Democratic Party. The same is true for abortion. The same is true for hardline anti-pornography laws. So it was really about Nixon pursuing these voters that he viewed as up for grabs. And the reason he was successful is because he was speaking to these pre-existing sentiments. Now, I want to briefly contrast this against kind of the existing view in political science. So this is a little bit academic, but here's a quote from a really famous piece on trying to understand the abortion realignment. And I'll read this quote out loud as you might be reading it now. Republican identifiers, meaning people in the electorate who called themselves Republicans, were originally more pro-choice than the Democrats. If politicians were truly following the lead of the masses on abortion, Democrats should have become less pro-choice, not more. And people look at this stylized fact to sort of fuel this argument that it was really politicians making choices, pushing the parties apart, or it was interest groups driving it. But when you look under the cover, you look at what politicians and operatives are saying in this era. They're explicitly not looking at just Republican identifiers when they craft these messages. They're in fact saying, we can't do that. They're trying to explicitly target these Wallace and Goldwater Democrats. They're already really conservative on abortion, and then as the strategy matures, you get gun control, gay rights, and then by the late 80s, I would say immigration has been added to that strategy in some parts of the country. And this strategy is encouraged by the fact that even though people who call themselves Republican are more likely to be pro-choice, people that are voting for Republicans are more likely to, or people that are voting for Democrats are more likely to be pro-choice, and vice versa. And the reason this is the case is party identifications are really sticky, and you're in the middle of this realignment. So you have a lot of independents, and you also have a lot of Democrats that are voting for Republicans. And so really thinking about this emergence among voters by vote choice before as a leading, I guess you could say it's a leading indicator of party identification. And they're focusing along this racial axis. Now in this final section, I want to talk about the early interest group environment around abortion. And in the time we have, I want to focus especially on the right. So just as a reminder, there's this existing view that party change, that initial split of Democrats and Republicans in the 70s, is really driven by activists that enter the party and push the parties apart. And I'm thinking about this from the perspective of, well, what about an alternative outcome? If it was activists really driving this change, could they have created, the anti-abortion movement and aligned it in the Democratic Party? Or were there broader forces at play? So I go into the archives of all these abortion activists of this era and some politicians and broader movement leaders. And you see this really interesting trend emerge, which is that activists involved in the early conservative abortion, and you see this with other issues and on the left as well, they're really open to either party picking up their cause. And this might sound a little bit odd to folks today, where we live in this polarized environment and we think of these interest groups as really entrenched in the party system. But that wasn't the case back then. Remember, parties don't really have positions, and interest groups that would become very prominent at the time were very young and weak, and so they were looking for support wherever they could get it. And Mildred Jefferson, who's the president of the National Right to Life Committee at the time, which would grow into one of the largest groups, the oldest and largest group they claim on the right, says the right to life is not a partisan issue, and the movement must vote for the man or woman who will support our political objectives. And in the 1976 primaries, they actually endorsed more Democrats than Republicans. They endorsed 2 Democrats, George Wallace and Ellen McCormick, and 1 Republican, Ronald Reagan. Well, that didn't work out too well for them because they all lost in the primary. And they go in very reluctantly, and campaign for Gerald Ford. And reluctantly, both because they didn't particularly like the Republicans, and they also didn't view Gerald Ford as really conservative enough on the issue. So in this case, the causal arrow is working in the opposite direction, I argue. Ford is taking this Nixon strategy, trying to pry off these conservative Democrats. They see this loosened from the Democratic Party. And the interest groups are following him after he's established that position. Now, it might sound odd, like why do the anti-abortion activists want to ally with the Democratic Party, or why are they upset that they're allying with the Republican Party? What's interesting is that the earliest activists on what we would call the pro-life movement on the right weren't the religious right or the Christian right that has become so associated with that movement today. Many of the founders of this movement are politically diverse, and many of them are otherwise liberal Democrats that really want to ally with the Democratic Party, and they really struggle to make that connection. So one of the people I follow in the book is this woman, Marjorie Mecklenburg, who's the first chair of the board of directors for the National Right to Life. And she and her husband, Fred Mecklenburg, founded the Minnesota Right for Life group, which is really the earliest and most successful anti-abortion activist group outside of the Catholic Church. in this era. And because they were so successful at the Minnesota level, they played a really founding role at the national level. And they called themselves liberals in the 1930s and 1960s. And they tried to link the anti-abortion movement in a web of liberal causes with social welfare programs, with the civil rights movement, with opposition to Vietnam. And in some of their planning notes, they're scribbling down, like, who might we recruit for this movement? And Mecklenburg writes down that women's rights activists and the peace activists would serve as the backbone of this movement. And it didn't quite work out that way. And she's one of the people that works for Ford very, very reluctantly, and is very dejected that the Republicans really had chosen to make this issue their cause. And this comes back to this woman, Nellie Gray, that I started the presentation with. Nellie Gray would go on to found the March for Life, a very, very prominent conservative abortion rally that happens each January in Washington, D.C. Here's then President Trump speaking at it while he was president. What's interesting about Nellie Gray is that she was a liberal Democrat working in the Labor Department in the 1950s and 1960s. And she was very involved in the civil rights movement. And when Roe v. Wade happens, she's distraught. She's very, very opposed to abortion. And she goes to Capitol Hill, and she seeks out Ted Kennedy and her other liberal Democratic allies from the civil rights movement and says, this is the next civil rights issue. Will you support my cause? And one by one, they turn her down. And the person who told me this story was worked with her in the early anti-abortion movement, said that Gray's jaw dropped when it was Republicans, rather than her Democratic allies, that ultimately agreed to support her cause. And in the book, sort of thinking about why is Nellie Gray or Marjorie Mecklenburg have such a hard time framing this issue in context of a broader suite of liberal issues, is that they're really trying to push against the stream. On average, the folks that are more conservative on abortion were more conservative on race and more conservative on other social issues at the time. And it was really difficult to link those together. And it was really difficult to align that in a Democratic Party that had this ascendant liberal wave. Now contrast the struggles of Mecklenburg or Nellie Gray with the rise of the Christian right, which very successfully is able to mobilize and frame the anti-abortion movement in a web of conservative causes. Now, what's interesting about what's called the religious right, Christian right, that's often associated with white evangelicals in the contemporary era, is that the Christian right initially mobilized not on the issue of abortion in the 1970s. They initially organized as a lobbying force in DC to oppose these things called seg academies, religious schools that were racially segregated, so only white students. And the Carter administration says, if you're segregating on the basis of race, you're going to lose your tax-exempt status. And so the Christian right mobilizes to fight this. At the end of the 1970s, they're thinking, well, how can we expand our movement? How can we maintain a presence? What issues should we pick up? And there's this famous story that's related by this guy, Paul Weyrich, who is viewed as really the founder of the religious right. And Paul Weyrich describes being on this conference call with these prominent evangelical ministers and activists. And he describes it as someone says, well, what if we try abortion? And it lit like wildfire and was very successful. And the point I make is that the reason that's so successful is because they're selling a package of issues that already went together among the mass public. If you think of the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the heart of evangelism in the 1970s, that's a Southern white institution with a Southern white laity. It's very conservative on race, and it's also very conservative on abortion. And so those things went together. Now, the last slide, and this comes up a lot, is, and some of you might be familiar with this history, which is the fact that white evangelical Christians become so prominent in the conservative abortion movement is a little bit of a puzzle in context of what happened in the decade prior, where opposition to abortion was really viewed as primarily a Catholic concern. And Catholics were uniquely conservative on abortion. And evangelical leaders and the Southern Baptist Convention itself were either quiet or supported moderate to liberal abortion reform. So it is true that in the 1960s, the initial effort at abortion reform was efforts to make it legal at all. So whether abortion should be legal if the mother's life is in danger. That was the first push. And it is true that Catholics were uniquely conservative when thinking about it that way. But by the end of the 1960s, the debate had started to shift about whether abortion should be a matter of choice, or at least a matter of choice for the first term, to a certain point. And when you look at it that way, evangelical Christians at the mass level are already very, very conservative. And this has been sort of missed. So this graph here is just the percent that oppose legal abortion in the first 3 months, 56% of folks overall. And then you have Catholics, 66% oppose, all Baptists, 66% oppose. And then if you break it down between white and black Baptists, so often when evangelicals are talked about in the political context, it's white evangelicals. And then we think about the Southern Baptist Convention being rooted in the South. What you see is that white Southern Baptists in the South are very, very, very conservative on abortion. And when Southern Baptist institutions were ignoring this issue or more moderate or liberal, there was sort of this discontent that swelled. And people got out of the pews and became activists to push the Southern Baptist Convention to the right, to mobilize evangelical leaders into the political realm. And this was part of a broader, some folks might be familiar with this history, but a part of a broader transformation within the SBC of moving into the right, not just on abortion, but other political issues and then theological issues at the time. I'm arguing it's fundamentally rooted here in the mass public. So just in a brief conclusion here, a lot of this book talks about things that happened in the 1960s and 1970s. But it's important because the racial realignment continues to shape our politics today. And as more and more issues get locked into the party system and are stacked on top of each other, this reinforces an already deep partisan divide. And I think there's also sort of a sad conclusion that I get out of this, which is that if we think of partisan polarization as driven by politicians alone, well, you might think that the opportunity for closing that gap could just be as simple as politicians working across the aisle. But if it's rooted in these deep structural forces, well, then the space for a solution becomes reduced. So thanks for listening. I really appreciate you coming out, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Neil. As Neil said, we have time for questions, and Ian has a mic. And so, go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like. Or if you can project, you can get the first one going.
Yes, as one of the older people in the room, there was one slip of the tongue. Wallace, of course, was a big segregationist, pretty much opposed integration. I think actually said it the other way. But when we talk about the roots of polarization, I've watched the media have a huge influence on this. I used to be a business professor, and I remember Walter Cronkite pitching in the middle and Dan Rather. Now people are siloing off into their own spheres, and I see a huge problem with being a lot more lies on both sides being accepted as causing some of the huge problems that I see today.
Yeah, so I think certainly, so the point I'm making here is that what's causing that initial shift? Is it the media or is it something else? And I would argue, and if you look at Fox News or you can look at various pieces of evidence, and certainly they're exacerbating a divide. But if you're thinking about like what is causing the initial divide, one, as you said, the mainstream news, CBS, the networks aren't terribly polarizing. And then if you look at various ideological outlets at the time, which isn't Fox News or MSNBC, but it might be magazines like the National Review or the New Republic. And you might be thinking, well, are they fomenting these divides in the 50s and 60s and setting the table for the polarization that comes? And what's remarkable is that, so I went through and looked at the pages of these magazines, they're very, very quiet on abortion, on guns, gay rights, women's rights. They're not talking about it. And some of the first articles that are published, so for example, The Nation, a very liberal magazine, the first article where they mention gun control, they're opposing gun control. They're saying this is the work of dictators. We can't do this. And so this media environment is very quiet, and it's also very crisscross. It's not lined up as what you would say. And so I guess that would be my addendum to your comment, which I think is right. Sure, the media plays a huge role today, but thinking about these initial seeds, it's a little bit of a mystery. That would be my take. Yeah. Right here. Yes.
By the way, can everyone hear, or would it be helpful to have the microphone, have the mic? I'm going to say, Ian, can you walk the mic back just so everyone can hear? Sorry.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. It's super interesting. I'm really curious. I'd love to hear you in your research. How did communism come up in some of this? And what role did communism and specifically anti-communism play as you found it in some of this work, especially as it relates to civil rights issues and the association of those two things? So I would love to hear more. Thank you. This is great.
Yeah, so if you're reading what some of these early thinkers are talking about, the forming of this new right that it's called, so people like William F. Buckley, who's the editor of the National Review, or this guy who gets a lot of play, Kevin Phillips. He writes this book called The New Republican Majority in '69 that people call like the blueprint of the New Republican Party. He probably gets more credit than is deserved at the time, and sort of viewed skeptically by some of the other figures of the new right. But yeah, it's communism shows up all the time. They hate the communists. Everything they don't like, they link to the communists, whether it's gun control or civil rights. And so that is very much a part of their writing at the time. So it is very much sitting in there. What I would argue, though, is thinking about, you have this New Deal party system. So maybe one way to answer your question is, like, is it this fight over communism that's pushing the parties apart, or is it this initial divide over civil rights? And I would argue that thinking about what's prying the South out of the Democratic coalition, and really is the only issue that can pry the South out of the Democratic coalition, is their abandonment of protecting the Jim Crow South and being the party of the South. And so I think certainly you can develop and talk about communism, and they're certainly talking about it at the time, but what's this initial cleavage? It's really about civil rights, and I would view it as, it's sort of a groupie argument where we don't like communists and we don't like this other thing, and so we're gonna link them together. Yeah. Thank you. Rucker?
Thank you so much for the presentation. I loved listening to it, and then find the argument very compelling. I may have missed this. In your presentation, but what do you think are the factors that are originally bundling these issues together? So, if you go all the way back to 1940 or earlier, why are these particular issues being bundled together?
Yeah, so in the book, I rely on theories in political psychology and public opinion that argue that it's this underlying sense of traditionalism or egalitarianism that are really driving and clustering these bundles together without these elite cues. And if you look at the writings of these early activists, they're not academics, but it's almost like you could take out some of these quotes and put them in any psychological paper on why do people, the political science literature on why do people think what they think, or why do they cluster things together. They're viewed as, whether it's civil rights or the issues of women's rights or gay rights, they view it as a fundamental threat to social order and change. And that's what, one argument I make. I think also in writing this book, and then I've done some other work on this after the fact, and maybe this ties into the first question, which is people are incredibly groupy. Like, they like one group, they dislike another group, and it could be, so thinking about race, it could be not just cleavages between white and black, but among white respondents that are more egalitarian and white respondents that are more conservative. And once things get attached and tied up into a group, it really does a lot to cluster these things together. And so I've become increasingly sympathetic, although I engage with it less in this book, of this really group-based view of that explains a lot of why people cluster things together. Is it values? Maybe, but it's a lot of just, I like this and not that. We're going to like and dislike the constellation of things around it. Thank you. Right here in the pink.
Do you think that what happened in the 1960s with people being unsatisfied that the Republican Party was essentially a watered-down Democratic Party, do you think that that's similar to what's happening right now in the United Kingdom with the rise of Reform UK as a more radically conservative party?
Yeah, you know, I'm not a comparative politics scholar, but I think that's a common thread across party systems. You have these entrepreneurs that are looking to build a movement or in this case, make a new political party, and I think that seems to fit very well with this theme. So an interesting thing about the conservatives, some of these leading conservative operatives in the 1970s, people like Paul Weyrich, for example, is they hate the Republican Party. And in some ways, they actually like the Democratic Party more because even if they don't like some of the principles, they view it as an effective political organization, while they view the Republican Party as just in complete disarray. And for a long time, it was like, we're going to build a new political party. And they would write about building new political parties, and that just never quite took off. I saw George Wallace or Reagan as the leader of that new party, and then Wallace went back to the Democrats, and Reagan, as you know, becomes a very prominent Republican. Yeah, right behind her.
So do you see any hope for ungrouping or growing some limbs in between those two branches?
Yeah. Oh, goodness. You know, I get this question a lot, and I don't have a great answer. But and this maybe a little adds to kind of a gloomy outlook. I was writing this. You know, I've been started this in grad school in 2016. So I'm writing this, and I'm like, what could potentially kind of reduce or lessen it? And one thought, and this isn't pleasant to say, but maybe some sort of economic crisis where it's just have to work together to, you know, pull out of a depression or recession. And it's sort of like what happened in the 30s. Then COVID hits, and it's just upends every part of political life, and it only seems to create more polarization, even though we're in a health and economic crisis. And so I'm not sure. I don't have a great answer for you. Madison.
Great, thank you for the talk. I look forward to reading the rest of the book. My question is kind of the opposite of Rutgers, maybe not the opposite, but on the other end. The leaders of, or some of the most prominent leaders in the pro-life movement, assuming that they would align with more of the women's movement seems kind of hypocritical to me. Do you have any, ideas or explanations for why they assumed that those would align? Because to me it seems so opposite.
Yeah, so for example, I talked to one, she was the lobbyist for the National Right to Life Committee, considered herself a liberal Democrat, and she was in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment. She viewed herself as staunchly in favor of women's rights. And in her words, she was like, and what are they going to do for the women's rights movement? They're going to make abortion legal and do nothing else. No equal pay, no workplace protection, and so on. So she viewed it as really kind of a betrayal of some of her core values. Another story that I think maybe illuminates some of this tension that I think from a modern perspective sounds odd, but the National Organization for Women in 1967 does endorse liberalized abortion. And it divides, it's very divisive along generational lines, where younger members were in favor of liberalizing abortion and older members opposed it for some of the same reasons. This is not core to our mission. And so I think to answer your question, that might be one thing that's in the back of your mind. And then one more thing I'll just add to this. The early proponents for what we're calling reforming abortion laws aren't women's rights activists. They're doctors who are initially organizing because they're put in these situations where if they perform an abortion, the woman lives, and if they don't, they die, but it's illegal. And so they're pushing to reform these early abortion laws and make these exceptions. And then you also have people who are concerned about a growing population become very prominent abortion advocates, and then also the women's rights movement, which that becomes very prominent in the face of that movement. By the end of the, certainly by the early to mid-70s. Yeah, Chandler?
So I buy this notion that these
certain attitudes or opinions are bundled prior to 1980. The thing that I'm interested in hearing you say more about, and you mentioned this, you gave this dialogue back about kind of responses, differential responses to the civil rights movement. And I'm interested to hear what you have to say about, I think that that's doing a lot of work. And I'm interested to hear like why you think that culture war issues became more salient relative to economic issues, which, you know, I think for much of political thought, you know, the haves and the have-nots have divided politics fundamentally. And so in an age of national prosperity, why are people, you know, polarizing on these issues with some economic, you know, impact, but less relative to tax policy and trade policy?
Yeah, so I think, you know, there's a prominent view that, like, why are these social issues becoming so prominent? It's because there is a certain amount of economic prosperity that's been achieved, which then provides leeway for a focus on what Engelhardt calls these post-material issues. And so that would be one answer to that question. I do think, you know, there's this other part where I think the fact of moving, whether you move to the left or the right, is fundamentally rooted in the mass public. But in terms of making things salient, some of that is this manipulation and work of strategic actors. But it's also sensitive to what people care about. So these, you know, again, focusing on the right, these conservative operatives are just in dismay. And they're like, how do we build a movement? And they were actually really upset at, like, the William Buckleys and the intellectual thinkers who they think are focusing on issues that people actually don't really care about, abstract tariff policies. Even if there's a material effect, people aren't in great angst over that on day-to-day, or these very abstract theories of economics. And they say, but they do care a lot about busing. They do care a lot about abortion. They do care a lot about issues around women's rights. And those are important, so let's provide a voice for that. But there certainly is some amount of, well, how does that become salient in the political system? You almost need an activist to make it salient, or you almost need a politician to make it salient in political conflict. Luis.
Thanks for the talk. I think I can speak. Thank you for the talk, very interesting. I was thinking in other cases that can be a counterfactual or adjust this hypothesis that the polarizations come from the roots, and then the political parties basically instrumentalize the polarization. So do you have anything about the wars? I was looking at the data and how hard was the U.S. to join the First World War, the Second World, now in Ukraine, or the invasion of Israel in Palestine. It is my feeling that we have some division in the in the civil society, in the public, but the parties appears to be very aligned on those issues. So what happens with other policies that might work in the opposite direction?
Yeah, so I think certainly the case. So when I first was writing this, I was considering, you know, Vietnam that's happening at this point, that's incredibly divisive. And, you know, thinking about that as a bottom-up versus top-down story. And I basically drop it because it does seem more elite-driven. Or I think some of the economic divides that you ultimately see, I think there's data suggesting a lot of that is more elite-driven. So I certainly don't think this can be applied to every issue. But I think these things that just are incredibly important, you know, some of the most important political transformations, abortion, immigration, gun control, gay rights, it's fundamentally, it's almost hard to, let me be a little more conservative in saying this. I think it's hard to understand these transformations without considering how politicians and activists are responding to these mass level forces. Is it all encompassing? No. You know, there are certainly, you know, there's some scope conditions, and I would put defense spending in Vietnam probably in context of that. Yeah. Maybe in the back, and then.
How do you think, like, unhappiness that, like, leftists today have with Democrats mirrors and differs from then conservatives, like, discontent with Republicans? I know a lot of it's, like, has to do with perceived lack of effectiveness, but how do those parties, like, evolve to be less effective or perceived to be less effective
so I guess that's a great question. So I think it's contingent on, thinking about today, like who is happy with like the Republican Party and who is unhappy with the Republican Party. That depends on what you think about Donald Trump or like where you're coming in the Republican Party. And I would say in context of the Republican Party in the 60s and 70s, there was that feeling as well. There's this younger insurgent force that grows for a variety of reasons, gains some amount of critical power. So in 1964, Barry Goldwater correctly makes the calculation that I can win the Republican nomination by being more conservative and upsetting this liberal establishment. And he wins. And in fact, the thinking after that is that you cannot win if you aren't staking these conservative positions. So then who's unhappy with that is the folks that were in power or had control under the old party system, would be my short answer to that question. And then thinking about politics today on the left, or thinking about politics on the left in the 1960s, is you had Hubert Humphrey in '68, who's part of the Democratic establishment that young liberal activists are very unhappy with. And there was some amount of generational line. So maybe the short answer to that great question is, I think some of it's generational, and things shift, and the electorate shifts, and there are these kind of secular forces that are pushing and at some point gain some critical amount of power and change our institutions. And the people who had power under the old regime are probably unhappy, and the people who have more power under the new alignment are more content. So that's kind of what comes to mind. That's a great question. I'll be in the back here. Save you, Dan. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the question here about the relative weight of the social issues and economic issues and potential explanations for that. And I wanted to ask if you found in your research, or maybe you didn't try to hunt this down, I mean, you've got this account of polarization over social issues. Does that correlate, does that go along with sort of centering of both parties on economic issues? And if so, when would you locate that? Looking at it from backwards from today, right? We're in the middle of a campaign where both presidents are trying to deficit spin their way into votes at unheard of levels. You mentioned COVID as a potential economic crisis. Of course, it wasn't, because we're all Keynesians now, right? So I don't know if you buy that kind of quick line of thinking there, but if you see any sort of sense in that.
Yeah, I mean,
what's the history of that?
So I would say one of the impetus or this line of thinking that emerges on the right is kind of what you're saying of in some very important ways, there is a consensus on economic issues, which is the New Deal. It's very popular. And even as and even for a long time, certain economic policies remain really popular among folks who are on the right. And so I think certainly this is what offers a divide. This is a way to differentiate. I also think, and this goes back to the question of salience, what people like Paul Weyrich and these conservatives on the right are really trying to push to, for example, Ronald Reagan, is not to be conservative on abortion, but to make it central to your campaign. Because his point was, if it's not, Southern Democrats or conservative Catholics are either going to vote for Democrats as they did in 1960, or they're just going to stay home. They don't care enough. And so there was this huge push of like, this is an issue that's important to the subset of voters that we can differentiate from the other party on. And so we need to make a big deal out of it. And you need to talk about it. Because otherwise we're going to lose this block of voters, and we're going to go back to the kind of the doldrums of never doing it. All right, Dan, we might be out of questions.
Yeah, so I love this book. So my question goes into the deep dive in the 1970s, which I love. That was really helpful. And it goes to your point about the origins of the Christian right and its assault on these southern white segregation academies, these schools that were whites only. And what I thought was really striking was that battle started way before Carter. That it actually was initiated during the Nixon years by Nixon's IRS. They asked him, he signed off on it, he said, yes, let's go for this. And that's not so much to go after the 1960 Nixon versus the 70s Nixon, but more to ask a question, two parts, I guess, to that, which is, do we take from that it started with Nixon, not Carter, that there's two different tiers of politics going on, one that might be electoral and rhetorical for Nixon's team presidency, and another that's kind of the administrative presidency, where he is on a less visible level pursuing something, or not. The other part is just that Nixon's so damn fascinating, right? Because he has, he's kind of a Rorschach test in a lot of this. So is that more the answer, or is that, yeah, so it's trying to make sense of the fact that, the Christian right's mobilizing after Nixon, but the original fire was set during the Nixon years.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So I think the one part of using the administrative state for political gains, my reading of some of his papers is that he did do that and did view that as an important part of trying to expand his coalition. I think the simplest answer was, and you see this with it's not until 76 you start to see this conversation around, evangelicals are actually really conservative on abortion. You don't see that yet in 72. And so I think it might have just, that constituency potentially might have been in a blind spot, and then as it just erupted under the Democratic coalition. Then you might argue, in some counterfactual world, well, if it comes to the Nixon administration's view, potentially they would have responded to a different way for some of these political reasons than Carter did during the late 70s. So that would be my gut feeling to that.
Great, thank you.
Elena.
Yeah, so I know this idea of identity politics is kind of new, but I'm wondering if we can stretch it back to understand how these ideas kind of become bundled in the first place. So I'm just thinking about the abortion example, and Madison mentioned it seems kind of counterintuitive to imagine that certain women would be pro-abortion, and sort of the center of this, as Luper points out, is that this sort of battle over what it means to be a mother, and there's a lot of sort of anxiety from women who sort of value their traditional place, that this access to abortion diminishes their power, their household power. So do you think that's a possible lens we could use, or some of your thoughts on?
Yeah, you see that a lot in this era. You certainly see it on the right of these, pro-abortion people are trying to undermine my role in society. It also is reflected in public opinion, where women are, you think of the distribution of attitudes on abortion, there are more women on the left, but there's also more women on the far right. And some of the early work on abortion attitudes points to that as one very prominent explanation for why you see that kind of perplexing, now what you might think of as a more perplexing dynamic of public opinion. But I think that's absolutely right.
So let's have our last question. I'm sure Neil will stick around for questions afterwards, but please join me in congratulating him on this.